Magnus Carlsen has returned to classical chess. He's competing in the Sigeman Cup in Malmö, Sweden. It's a small 8-player all-play-all that features actually quite a challenging lineup. For example, Norbek Abisatorov, number 4 in the world and on tremendous form over the last few months. And then, well, let's look at the others. We've got Arjun Erigaisi, Indian star. Then we've got two very young players. We've got Andy Woodward from the States. He's just turned 16 years old. An incredible talent, incredibly hard working. Yazkan Edomush, the 14-year-old from Turkey. Got Jordan van Foreest from the Netherlands, who's had quite a spurt recently. Nils Grandelius from Sweden. And then we've got Zhu Jin from China. So it's a very interesting lineup. Now, what happened to Carlsen in round 1? He drew against Erigaisi. Solid draw. He tried to squeeze Erigaisi in an endgame. But not a terrible start for him, as Erigaisi is such a strong player. And then in round 2, well, he played Nils Grandelius from Sweden. So we're going to look at that game in this video. By the way, why is he playing in the Sigeman Cup? Well, for him, this is a little warm-up tournament. He plays in Norway Chess at the end of May, which features a mix of classical chess and blitz. And that's on his home turf, and he doesn't want to go into that tournament cold. And that has a really, really strong lineup, even stronger than this one. But this is a real test for him. Anyway, let's take a look at the game between Nils Grandelius and Magnus Carlsen. Nils Grandelius playing white, and he goes for d4. And we might normally expect here perhaps a Nimzo Indian, bishop b4 or maybe d5, very standard, solid openings. But Carlsen plays the Benoni. Well, this is pretty rare at the top level. It's the kind of opening, we all played when we were young, and then gave it up because it was just too risky. So Carlsen clearly wants a big fight. And Grandelius plays a variation which, well, when I was playing this as a teenager, this was really unknown to developing this bishop at such an early stage. Normally it was just left on c1 and you play knight f3 and that's standard. But one of the reasons is that if black attacks the e-pawn very quickly, the knight drops back and you can see the bishop is already developed instead of being shot in on c1. So that's the idea behind it. Bishop g4 played by Carlsen. So this is a good idea, I think, to get rid of this bishop, which often struggles to find a good diagonal. So bishops exchanged. And Grandelius castle. So yes, you can see that again, with the knight on d2, the bishop is not blocked in on c1. It's already developed on e3. So that's the idea behind this early development. So black can play rook e8 here, but Carlsen goes for knight e8. So two ideas. The knight might switch to c7 to support b5. But it also lets the f-pawn loose. And that's Carlsen's idea here. Now I'm going to return to this moment at the end of the game. Because it's actually very interesting how Grandelius approaches this. Anyway, he went f4. And yes, this is perhaps not best. f5 from Carlsen. So he just stops the f-pawn in its tracks and counters in the middle. And Grandelius decides to exchange on f5. It doesn't have to exchange immediately. You could play a4 here. But anyway, he took and g takes. So this means that Carlsen might be able to use these squares, in particular e4, on that open e-file. and this f-pawn blocks in the bishop. And this bishop looks fantastic on the long diagonal. Knight c7, knight f3, knight f6. So you can see that having knocked out the e-pawn, then the d-pawn is vulnerable, but also that knight could perhaps look at moving into e4. So things have turned out pretty well for Carlsen. Queen d3 to defend the pawn. Also looks at the f5 pawn. Now Carlsen could play very carefully with queen d7 and then perhaps shift the rook over to e8, but instead, well, he takes the game by the scruff of the neck. So he wants to complicate the position. Of course, getting this queenside majority rolling is a pretty standard idea in the Benoni, but this is a pawn sacrifice. Yeah, I mean, it's possible for white to take here, but this already looks very nice for black, having knocked out white's centre. You can see these pawns control lots of really important squares, and it means that white's minor pieces are shut out of the game. That's better for black. So knight takes pawn and rook b8. So nice, well, temporary pawn sacrifice. Getting rid of that knight on c3 means the knight can occupy e4 really nicely. The b file is open for the rook and the diagonal open for the bishop. Looks really nice for black. And where is white's counterplay here? Rook b1. Okay, stepping away from the bishop. Now instead of taking on b2, which would give white the chance to exchange pieces, Carlsen played an excellent move here, queen a5. So stops knight d2, threatens this pawn, and Carlsen has a really nice initiative now. Grandelius played knight g5, so this is a key moment in the game. Time for you to have a think. Time for me to have a drink from my mug of tea. So, black to play, what would you play next? Cheers. Do you want to improve your chess? Get access to live masterclasses with yours truly? Then subscribe to patreon.com/PowerPlayChess, and for just $25 a month, you get a newsletter with a test game, calculation puzzles, a monthly opening survey, access to an archive with over 100 opening surveys. And you can join in live masterclasses exclusive to patrons where you can ask me questions directly over Zoom. All for only $25 per month. Do subscribe to patreon.com/PowerPlayChess and join the club. Well, there are lots of pawns that can be taken here, but Carlsen decided not to capture anything for the moment. You know, you could exchange on g5 and take one of these, but no. Played a much stronger move, queen d2. And this really squashes white's counterplay and pushes this queen to a worse square. So if the queens are exchanged, then that forks the rooks, no good for white. So the queen had to move, queen h3. And only then did Carlsen get rid of this menacing knight. Now again, there are lots of options here. You know, you could take on g5, but Carlsen plays rook takes b2. So there's an exchange here. Leaving that pawn on g5, but actually this pawn has real potential to advance. Well, in fact, Carlsen didn't advance that one for the moment. Instead, he played queen takes a2. So he's looking at that d5 pawn. And that keeps white on his toes. I mean, once this one is captured, that looks very serious. g6. Okay, a little bit scary, trying to open up the king, but Carlsen keeps it closed. Now, to counter this threat, queen f3. This is another absolutely crucial moment in the game. It's hard to imagine that black has a very clear advantage here. I mean, it looks very unclear, actually. You know, with this pawn on g6, if white manages to break through to the king side, then obviously the black king could be in trouble. This queen has gone on an adventure and doesn't seem to be connecting with black's pieces very well. Nevertheless, there is a very strong continuation here. And maybe not the obvious move. I mean, the obvious move seems to me to be to push pawn to c4. Get this pawn going. You know, it's not so far off the queening square. In fact, this would give white an excellent chance for counterplay. Queen e3. And the queen comes into e6 and takes on d6. This is actually very tricky. Instead, Carlsen very coolly pushes the a pawn. I mean, this looks so slow. But the difference is this. If white tries to get the queen in with queen e3 and queen e6 check, then simply queen takes d5. And that covers everything. And that leaves white in a bit of a hole. This is a struggle. Grandelius played h4. Well, it might connect here at some point, but basically, you know, it gives the king an escape square if this rook manages to get in. But actually, this a pawn is just too fast. Queen f4. Okay, threatening this one. And it means if queen takes d5, then the queen can take on a4. So that's the difference. But Carlsen just kept pushing. It's just very route one. Very direct play. So Grandelius took on d6 and queen b2. So it's a very clear strategy, just to queen the a pawn. And in fact, white just doesn't have enough at the other end of the board. So bishop takes c5, a2. Queen e6, king h8. Now, if bishop takes rook, this is important. In fact, this is a winning move. Because here, check, rook f2, and then you make a queen. I'm afraid it's just not enough for white at the other end of the board. King h2 played, and now just an exchange of queens. And rook d8, just making sure the rook won't be taken. And the pawn is going to queen on the next turn. Now Carlsen made that look very, very simple. His last few moves really, a5, a4, etc. Very straightforward, but actually that involved some precise calculation, making sure that Grandelius didn't have enough counterplay. And you know, from this moment on, actually after knight g5, you know, this was superb play from Carlsen. So there were lots of tempting alternatives actually, but Carlsen did extremely well. Let's go back to the opening because this is really important. In fact, Carlsen said afterwards, if you play a move like f4, well, he said, if you cannot justify this quickly, then it's positionally dubious. Yeah, it's one of those moves that looks automatic. But in fact, you know, after f5, it's now a little bit problematic because the bishop is shut in. If we come back here, you know, something like a4 just looks much better. Just to make sure that break with the b5 isn't coming, or not soon anyway. And if black plays f5, then that can be taken. For example, g takes, then bishop f4. There you go. The bishop actually isn't shut in. Or rook takes f5. Knight here, and well, White's king can feel a lot more secure with 3 pawns in front of it, and that bishop nicely supported on e3. That's a very different story. In fact, this is precisely the move that, coincidentally, I was discussing in my latest masterclass for my patrons. And actually, just to mention to my patrons, I'll be posting the whole of that masterclass on the Patreon channel very, very soon, once we've done a little bit of editing. So look out for that. But yeah, it's such a common theme. Advancing pawns. Pawns can't move backwards. This is something that is often forgotten. And I know it sounds very trite, but in fact, I see this all the time in amateur games. Pawn moves are made very easily, but then they're regretted later. Of course, I should forgive my words to Nils Grandelius, who's a very, very strong professional. He understands this very well. I suspect that he'd calculated something and it didn't work out, and suddenly he was regretting f4. Anyway, there we go. I should give you the scores after 2 rounds. Abdusattorov has 1.5. Andy Woodward has 1.5, and Carlsen has 1.5 as well. And I think we have Carlsen against Abdusattorov in round 3, so that is going to be a cracker.